Hello, I'm Marcus Railton, and this is the Scots Care podcast. Scots Care is the only charity dedicated to helping disadvantaged Scots in London through a range of support, including mental health therapy, financial grants, advocacy, sheltered housing for older Scots, job coaching, social events, befriending, and support for children and families. The charity's been running for 400 years to help break the cycle of poverty experienced by some Scots in London. In this series of the Scots Care podcast, I'll be chatting to celebrities and supporters of the charity that have forged a life often away from Scotland and about the ups and downs that can bring. This week's guest on the podcast is a real world citizen, a writer with Scots heritage, a Chinese mother, and brought up in Canada. Amy McCulloch is the youngest Canadian woman to summit Mount Manaslu in the Americas. She is also the author of the best-selling novel, Breathless. Breathless is one of the most gripping thrillers of the last 12 months, and it was the Sunday Times Crime Book of the Month.
Scots Care.
Hi, Amy.
Hi Marcus.
How are you?
Great, thank you. A bit miserable out there today. I was walking the dog this morning and it was, very rainy and wet down here.
Well, the same here. Do you know what? We decided that the traffic where we live is so terrible that I was going to start running my kids to school on the bike, and I thought it's a good way to get fit. And my older boy Noah, he goes to school on his own bike. He goes to high school, but I've got a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old. So my 4-year-old Indy, I got a seat for her and I stuck it on the back of my bike, and Rafe, he cycles along beside us, and it's only 2 or 3 miles, but it kind of gets the blood flowing in the morning and puts him in a better mood. But today was the first day I thought, oh, this is proper cold. I could feel it in my fingers.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can imagine.
Yeah, and I think it's okay for the rider, but when Indy's sitting behind me and it's just pouring down, or a smur as you'd call it in Scotland, it's just that kind of really wet rain, and she got quite miserable this morning.
Oh dear.
Yeah. But let's talk about, I want to talk about Breathless, because that's been such a great success for you, and it just instantly captured my imagination as well. But you've written many books before that, but many of them were for children and young adults. What initially drew you to that audience?
That's a good question. I think when I started writing, I was actually at university, and so it was sort of a reflection of a lot of the books I was reading at the time, or reading for leisure at the time. I was sort of grown up on books like the Golden Compass series by Philip Pullman, also the Harry Potter generation, of course. The Hunger Games was really big at that time. So that kind of young adult literature really appealed to me. But I also loved a lot of fantasy, and a lot of epic fantasy is sort of starts off with that that Bildungsroman, the young boy kind of growing up, or the chosen one kind of trope, I suppose. And I loved those kind of stories, but at the time I wasn't seeing a lot that was reflecting my background. So my mum is Chinese, and I grew up on a lot of kind of Chinese mythology, and at that time there wasn't a lot of epic fantasy out there that was based on kind of more Eastern cultures, I suppose. So that's sort of what I wanted to start out doing. That's what my initial kind of spark was to write a book that I wasn't finding on the shelves to read myself. And that became my kind of first published novel. And I actually loved writing for children and young adults because they're a great audience. I used to go out to schools all the time and talk to kids, and you have to be able to capture their attention really immediately and keep them turning the pages. And so I found it quite rewarding to write for that audience. But when it came to Breathless, it couldn't be the inspiration for it, the way it came about just couldn't be for young adults. And it was quite daunting to think about changing genres sort of midway through my career.
Well, but this is it, isn't it? And I was thinking about, I actually think in many ways it's more difficult to write for young adults because they are complicated little people, and as you said, you've got to they don't really have a lot of tolerance for bullshit. So certainly, my 13-year-old doesn't. You have to, and because they're of this generation where it's going to be next, it's all YouTube. So as you said, you've got to capture them from the outset and keep their interest, which I think is a more difficult ask in many, many ways.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You're competing with, video games and streaming services and television. And yeah, you have to be able to instantly draw a young adult, a teenager in, and as you said, keep them turning those pages. And so it's sort of an interesting, but ultimately, once you've hooked a child onto your story, you won't get a more devoted fan, and that's when you really see how wonderful it is to write for that age group. Once you get it right, the messages that I receive, or talking to them about how books that they love have impacted them, that's what makes me kind of want to write more and more.
Is it quite a healthy audience at the moment? Because a lot of times I'll say to my sons will say to me, "Oh, have you seen this film?" And I've said, "No, I've not seen the film, but I've read the book." And they'll go, "It's a book?" But and I say, "Yes, here is the book. Go and read it. Get off your screens." Are there still enough kids reading books out there?
Well, I think actually it's interesting because I know with TikTok, it's really changed the way that audiences find books. So in a way, there's been a kind of a resurgence of sometimes older books, or books that might have not had that huge media attention first time around, that have kind of stormed onto the bestseller lists. And a lot of those are books that appeal to kids who are struggling with their identity. So I know that a lot of the LGBTQ books are really big at the moment. Books that deal with like Heartstoppers. There's a Netflix series that became really massive. So I do think there is a big reading audience out there, but the way that they're finding books is changing.
Now, for you, this must have been a bit of a busman's holiday, because you were working in publishing, and then you're working 9 till 5 or 8 till 6. You're doing a full day, and then coming home and then writing. How I just a lot of the time I just want to pour a glass of wine and watch the telly.
Yeah, I think it's something, as I said, I've been writing since university, and so I was always used to kind of squeezing writing into those times where I was after I'd finished my assignments, or when I was just had a moment to grab a coffee or something, I would always be scribbling in my notebook. And when I needed to go out into the real world and kind of find a job, I knew I loved working with books, so kind of publishing was a natural fit for me. But again, I was still writing, but often instead of going straight home after work, I would stop off at a cafe, and I would be one of those, really cliched people kind of typing on their laptop in Starbucks in the corner, just trying to squeeze an extra hour or two of writing into my day. But I think what I always say is that even if I wasn't a published author, even if this writing career wasn't going anywhere, I would still be a writer. That's just it's almost like part of my DNA. It's something that I am. I love telling stories, even if I was the only person to end up reading them. So I think it's both my hobby and my work now. It's something I love, and now it's the way that I make my income. So in a way, I'm really privileged. But yeah, when I was working full time, it was just squeezing writing into any spare moment that I had.
Now, the Breathless, like you said, is not it's not a young adult book. It was a change of genre for you, and the way it came about is such a I don't want to say fantastic story, but it is a fantastic story, because there was a massive negative side to it. But it came about because you got divorced and you were going through
Yeah.
such a tough time in your life, and you decided, am I right in saying that you decided that instead of wallowing in it, and just putting the dressing gown on or a onesie on and just sitting and binge eating ice cream, you decided to get out and walk?
That's exactly right. It was a really difficult period in my life because I had only been married for a year. We'd been together for 10 years. And it kind of blindsided me, because I really thought that I had, I knew which path my life was going on, if you know what I mean. I sort of had the relationship, then the engagement, the wedding. I thought family was going to be in my near future. And all of a sudden that was sort of ripped away from me, and I didn't know what direction to turn in. And not only that, but I was struggling a little bit in my writing career. I'd come to the end of a book contract, and I didn't seem to have any new ideas, and really felt like all around my grand plans for my life had crumbled. And I didn't know what to do with myself. And I'd actually moved back. I'm from Canada originally, and I'd moved back to Canada, but was completely untethered. Didn't my family weren't there anymore. I didn't have any real friends over there. And I just decided, you know what, this is an opportunity for me just to put myself in the way of beauty. It was sort of that Cheryl Strayed. I don't know if you've read Wild or seen the Reese Witherspoon movie Wild, but she talks about how going on a long walk really helped her overcome some difficult life challenges. And I thought that's kind of what I need, but maybe not as extreme as the Pacific Coast Trail initially. And I found the longest waymarked trail in Ireland, which is called the Kerry Way. And literally the day after my ex-husband left, I flew out to Dublin, got on a train to Kerry and started walking. And I just fell in love with where my feet could take me, just what I was seeing, how I was able to kind of remain present. I wasn't on my phone all the time. I wasn't worrying about the future. All I was thinking about was what, the next step, kind of, one foot in front of the other. And I really, at the end of it, had fallen in love with walking. And then so I decided that the next trip I was going to take was to Nepal to do one of the classic treks there, the Annapurna circuit. So again, on my own, I flew out there and started walking. And that's where I kind of saw these big mountains for the first time and really just fell in love with that landscape.
Now, can I ask you about, I read a lot about you before we had a chat today, and, the walking comes up, and I think it works for you. And it's interesting to hear what you're saying there is that it allowed you to have a detachment and to think of other things. And I think for me, it made me think of when my mum passed away. And unless my brain was very busy, it kept on returning to her at that point. And what I'm not very good at is while I enjoy exercise, I'm not terribly good at something that doesn't completely either exhaust me or take up all my brain space. And my worry with walking, and I at that point I tried yoga, but I felt that every time I was still, all I would do is, like, if I was looking at the ceiling or looking at the floor, my brain would just immediately shift back to the negative thoughts about my mum passing away. So I found it really interesting that you gave yourself all this time, but you weren't, you were more positive about it. You didn't walk for miles dwelling on the negative.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, to be honest with you, I wasn't a big walker before this. So for me, walking at that time was 35 kilometers a day. That was totally exhausting me.
That's a long way.
It was a long way each day. The Kerry Way is, I think, 220 kilometers or something, and I did it over a period of 10 or 11 days. So I was walking, a fair distance each way, and what I loved was that I was coming to the end of it, because for me, the daytime, seeing the beautiful coastline, everything, that was distracting enough. But the nights were the worst time for me. That's when I would have my mind racing, when I would, feel most kind of depressed and really unable to shake the kind of negative self-talk. And so arriving to a bed after having walked for 30 kilometers and just allowing my body to kind of exhaust itself and actually sleep properly, that was what was most beneficial for me. And I think what helped me kind of remain positive and feel almost rejuvenated, or at least at least hopeful for the future at the end of it. Just giving my mind and my body time to rest, I think, was the most important thing, and exercise really, and walking was the key to that.
Did you know Scots Care can help second and even third generation Scots break the cycle of deprivation? Key services include financial grants, mental health support, social events for the Scots community, and more.
Have you seen Stutz on Netflix?
Have I seen what? Sorry?
It's called Stutz. It's
oh no!
I know it's a really odd title. It's the actor Jonah Hill,
okay,
and he's interviewing his therapist. And it's just what you just said made me think of it. And it's all shot in black and white. It's very intimate, and it's just Jonah Hill interviews his therapist and films one session. And Phil Stutz is this psychiatrist, and he talks about the first thing you can do if you're feeling directionless, or if you don't know where you're going to go next, is to get your life force back on track. And I thought, oh, that sounds kind of what you were talking about and what you tried to do there. And he's talking about the first step of recovery, and it's a great documentary. He draws out this triangle and he puts 3 lines through it, and the bottom level is your relationship to your physical body. And he says this is 85% of the way to recovery. And Jonah Hill goes, wow, that's amazing. And I think that's true. I think if you can get your physical body, eat well, exercise, then that's great. And then he moves up a level and he says the next one is your relationship to people. And don't isolate yourself when you're going through grief or you're going through trauma. You've got to get out there and have lunch with someone, maybe even someone you don't particularly love or like, but just have that kind of people interaction. And then at the top level, he talks about your relationship to yourself. And within that, he says, one of the most important things you can do is get a journal and start to write, because when you start to write, what will come out is how you truly feel about stuff. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, definitely. I think that's important, because I think sometimes your own mind kind of shields you from, what it considers traumatic events or things that or tries to stop you from kind of wallowing in the depression, but also dealing with it, I suppose, in a lot of ways. And that's what physical exercise for me and walking unlocked, was this just this sort of ability to kind of really feel properly. I know that sounds really strange, but by the end of each day, I was sort of really able to kind of deal with the big emotions that I was feeling and thinking about. And I think that helped me, I say, find that new direction, change paths, and tackle the next big challenge in my life, which turned out to be this mountaineering journey that I went on, and really feel that what had felt so negative that happened to me could actually end up being a positive thing.
When you went to Nepal, was it at that point, because there's a beautiful video on your website which is shot in Nepal, and it's of you there, and I get why you thought this was such an amazing place, because even watching the video, the scenery is stunning. And was it at that point, was it a slow fermentation that you wanted to start actual mountaineering, or was there a kind of light bulb moment at that point where you says, I'm going to climb a mountain?
It was a little bit of a light bulb. On the Annapurna circuit, you go up to about 5,500 meters, which is a very decent high altitude destination. You can experience severe altitude sickness at that height. You have to acclimatize, even though it's just a trek, and a very popular one. And I discovered that I actually handled the high altitude zones really well. My body seemed to have this capability to be strong, to continue to handle the intensity of the walk really well, even at high altitude. And it was a comment that my guide at the time, who I was with, made to me, that I started off really slow kind of in the beginning, and then the higher we got, almost the more strength I seemed to have. And it kind of sparked this curiosity in me about how high maybe I would be able to go. But I didn't have any idea where to start. But it just so happened that I met somebody who had been doing a little bit of mountaineering. He'd just come back from Kilimanjaro when we first met. And he and some of his friends had been talking about potentially how to climb Mount Everest one day. And having just come back from Nepal, I thought, oh wow, that's really interesting. I would love to know what that pathway is to climb Mount Everest. Something I had never considered in my life, that would be something that I would be capable of, not even a remote possibility. And together we went to a mountain in Morocco called Toubkal, which is the highest mountain in North Africa in the Atlas Mountains. And we ended up summiting on New Year's Day 2018. So as the sun was rising on a new year, we were at the summit and just watching the sun come up over the Sahara Desert and the Atlas Mountains. And it was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. I'd really challenged and pushed my body, but the reward, the summit, was so incredible that I kind of caught this summit fever. I thought, this is the best thing. And the guide on that trip had summited Everest several times and had led expeditions on Everest. He was the youngest British man to climb Everest from both the north and south side. So he was the perfect person to ask for advice as to how someone who, like me, who Tubcal, that was my first ever summit, my first mountaineering experience, how I could one day climb Mount Everest. And he said, there's a few things you need to consider. You need to consider how your body handles extreme high altitude. So you need to test yourself on higher and higher peaks. So I already knew how well I did at about 5,000 meters. So I needed to climb something that was more like 6, 7, work my way up and see how my body handled that. Then I needed to see how I could handle expedition life, because one of the hardest things about doing a Mount Everest expedition isn't necessarily the climb to the top of the mountain. It's the fact that you have to spend months on end living in a tent on a glacier, with people you don't know, without running water, in quite extreme conditions. And that isn't for everybody.
Yeah, definitely not.
No, definitely not. Exactly. And then the third one, of course, for Mount Everest especially, is that you have to have a lot of money or be able to save up a lot of money, because a Mount Everest expedition can be upwards of $50,000 to $60,000.
Wow.
Yeah, so that sort of put a damper on that trip, on the idea of Mount Everest. But the idea of mountaineering and keeping on testing myself at high altitude, that was really appealing. So I decided that I would try one more expedition and see how I did, and that was to Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in the Americas, on the Argentinian-Chilean border. And when I was looking for a guide for this, I had kind of known that I'd wanted to go back to Nepal eventually and maybe climb in Nepal, maybe not Everest necessarily, but I wanted to get to know a potential guide in Nepal, especially if I was going to climb with a Sherpa who I would be dependent on for my life. Essentially, I wanted to have known them and climbed with them beforehand. So I was looking up Nepali guides who would lead expeditions in Argentina. And that's when I came across Nims Dai, who had just started his expedition company. At that time, it was called Elite Himalayan Expeditions. And he was running an Aconcagua trip, and it was like the perfect timing. And he was kind of an unknown at that point in the mountaineering world, but he had been setting a couple of records on Everest. He was a former Gurkha SBS soldier, so he had all these credentials. And when we chatted initially over the phone and then on the internet, he seemed like a person I would really trust in the mountains, despite not having had his expedition company for that long. So kind of took a chance on that, really, and booked this trip with him and his guiding team, and it ended up setting off this incredible experience climbing with this man who would go on, of course, to star in the 14 Peaks Netflix series, and just kind of shake up the mountaineering world in a whole. He has changed the way people approach mountaineering in kind of to its foundations. And at that point, he hadn't done his big project. He was in the planning stages. And after we climbed Aconcagua together in probably some of the worst conditions that you can imagine, it was, minus 40 degrees. It was blowing a gale. But somehow he led us all to the summit and back down safely, because getting back down is just as important. He said, "Look, I'm trying to do this, break this world record. I'm trying to summit all the 14 peaks in the shortest amount of time possible. I want to lead a team on one of the mountains, that's Manaslu. Would you like to come along?" And for me, it felt like an opportunity I couldn't say no to, because not only was I going to have the experience to climb an 8,000 meter mountain in Nepal, but I was also going to be able to witness kind of history being made.
And was that a big step up? Because Manaslu is the eighth highest peak in the world.
Yeah.
Is that suddenly you're playing in the lower leagues that all of a sudden you've been subbed on in the Premiership?
Yeah, it's a massive step up, definitely. I mean, especially going from having only done my first ever mountain, earlier that same year, to then climbing an 8,000-meter peak the year after. That is a very, very, very big jump. A rapid rise is my pun.
Rapid. That's a nice way to put it. Can I ask you something about something you said when you were talking about Manaslu? Is you said the air was there, it just wasn't doing what it was supposed to. What does that mean?
Well, that's what my way of trying to explain what it's like up in the death zones. The death zone is anything above 8,000 meters, which is generally where it's considered impossible to acclimatize. So your body will never be able to survive above 8,000 meters for very long. So every minute you spend up there, your brain cells are dying. But for me, it was hard to imagine what that was like until, of course, I got up there into the death zone itself. And that was when I could, it wasn't as if sometimes people compare it to scuba diving, or this idea of not being able to kind of catch your breath. The idea that there's not enough oxygen in the air is kind of difficult to conceptualize, because it actually does feel like there is air around you. You don't feel like you're gasping necessarily. That's not what it felt like for me. It felt like I was trying to breathe normally, and yet it wasn't. My body just wasn't functioning properly. Every step that I took seemed to take twice, 3 times as long. Sometimes I watch videos of myself at that altitude, and you think, why aren't you moving normally? Why is it taking you so long to unclip the water, the top of your water bottle so you can take a drink? Why is it taking you so long to remove your gloves? And that's the lack of oxygen. It's like, as I said, the air is there. You can feel it. The wind is buffeting you. You can feel it and enter your lungs, but it just isn't enabling your body. The oxygen is not getting to your muscles, to your cells, to enable you to do what you would normally do at a much lower altitude. It's a very, very strange feeling.
And when you summited that became a record. You were the youngest Canadian woman. Do you still hold that? The youngest Canadian woman to summit Manaslu? Is that still your record?
Well, technically, so Manaslu is a very interesting mountain. It's been in the news quite a lot this year. There was a bit of controversy over where the real summit of Manaslu is or was. According to the Himalayan database, yes, I am still the youngest Canadian woman to summit Mount Manaslu. But since that time, in fact, last year, they've actually changed the position of where the summit was. So if you're an extreme mountaineering purist, then I was maybe 2 or 3 meters beneath the summit.
Okay.
So I haven't summited the mountain, but it actually discounted this change of the summit discounted the records of all but 3 mountaineers in history. So even Reynold Messner, who is the kind of legend of the mountaineering world, this incredible man who summited the 14 without oxygen, his record was stripped from him because he actually hasn't summited the true summit of Manaslu, which was only established and is now the kind of established summit going forward. So the answer is yes and no. According to the Himalayan database, yes. According to the new height of the summit of Manaslu going forward, no.
Did you know Scots Care provides homes for older Scots across London? If you or yours are finding it hard to find a home, we've close on 100 high-quality sheltered housing flats to help make a fresh start.
Can I ask you, aside from the physical achievement, because it's stunning, it's a mind-blowing achievement, was there a spiritual moment for you as well? Because when I look at the pictures of you there and the pictures of you in Nepal, it seems a very spiritual area. And then I just wonder if there was a cathartic moment of freedom where you could kind of shake off your past. I mean, maybe I'm being too spiritual. I just wondered if you felt anything more than the physical achievements.
Oh, absolutely. Before any summit or any mountaineering expedition in Nepal, you experience something called a puja ceremony, which is a blessing where you're asking the mountain for its blessing to climb. And a lama comes up from the local village. There's a fire. They chant to the mountain, and you put offerings down, and you lay down some of your equipment, often the equipment that will come into contact with the mountain, so your boots or your ice axe, and you ask for those pieces of equipment to be blessed. But what it was for me, I was sitting on some mats just behind the lama as he was sort of pounding his drum and reading this from this incredibly intricate scroll and chanting. That was for me probably my most impactful moment on the mountain. So I hadn't even set foot on the actual mountain itself. I was only at base camp. I hadn't climbed Camp 1 yet, but already I was feeling like my trip to the mountain had been worth it. So even if I didn't make the summit, I mean, I had no idea at that point whether I would be capable or not, whether the weather would allow us or not, whether the Manaslu is very prone to avalanches, whether it would be a bad avalanche season or not. All of these things that that were out of my control. I had no idea if I would make the summit, but sitting there listening to the lama, watching the kind of clouds disperse over the summit of Manaslu, and the kind of sun stream down on us, that for me was such an impactful moment. And I thought, wow, if my life hadn't gone the way that, if I hadn't experienced all the negative things, all the things that I thought would break me, I would never have found myself in that place. And that was enough. That was enough to have made that journey worthwhile. And it was a very spiritual and an important moment for me.
And I think what I've read is this is where you came up with the plot for Breathless, and
it was
Waterston's it's the Waterston Thriller of the Month book, the Sunday Times Crime Book of the Month. Without ruining the plot, which you obviously won't do, can you give us a clue? Can you give us a kind of précis of what Breathless is about?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was at base camp, one of the things that was, there's a lot of waiting around at base camp. That's the one thing that I didn't realize about mountaineering, is that actually there's a lot of downtime and a lot of time where you're waiting, to summit, or you're waiting for your body to acclimatize. So for me as a writer, that was when my kind of imagination was running wild. And I realized then that how perfect a base camp was as a setting for a thriller, particularly because not only are you facing the environmental dangers, the crevasses, the avalanche potential, the lack of oxygen, the high altitude sickness. There are no authority figures on the mountain. There's no police presence. There's no one investigating. And also you're there on the mountain with, these strangers, people that you don't know, who have come from all different backgrounds with a lot of different motivations for the reasons why they're there, why they're climbing. And it was really fascinating to me how, if someone had nefarious intentions, how easily it would be to kind of get away with murder on the mountain. And so that was sort of what sparked Breathless. So Breathless follows the journey of a journalist who is covering a story of a legendary mountaineer who is attempting to break a world record on the mountain. And there are a series of kind of unfortunate incidents that lead to fatalities on the mountain that are just written off as accidents, as something that is a natural part of what happens on these mountaineering expeditions. But Cecily begins to wonder if there isn't something more happening, and whether she's not just facing a killer climb, but also a killer on the mountain.
I just want to go dum dum dum.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This, do you know what? It's, when I read the jacket of the book and looked at the press release and stuff, I thought, oh, this has got film written all over it. Lots of suspects, no authority figures, an amazing landscape, the jeopardy of the actual climb. Have you been approached by any TV or film studios?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I have a film agent, and we've been talking with various different networks Actually, it's interesting because a lot of it has been TV related, which I find fascinating because I thought it would maybe be a bit more filmic, but the way that obviously we consume media nowadays, the streaming services are sort of where it's at, I suppose. So in the film and TV world, and this idea that you could really explore each of the different climbers and their motivations in episodes before kind of leading up to that dramatic conclusion where it all comes together. And there also aren't that many mountaineering films or series or books either that feature women as the kind of central protagonist. And that was something that was important to me as well. So it would be great to see it one day dramatized.
That would be fantastic. And will there be a follow-up?
There is a follow-up. It's not a sequel, but it is a very kind of similar feeling book. It's called Midnight. It'll be out next summer, and it's set in Antarctica, which is another place that I was lucky enough to visit in 2016. And so all of my books going forward, I think, are going to be these kind of women in extraordinary places, doing things that push the boundaries. So I've got a Marathon des Sables book as well. So that's the marathon through the Sahara Desert, the 250 kilometer
which you actually did. Desert. You're not just writing about this. You actually, I've watched that on the telly, and it's a phenomenal feat, isn't it?
Yeah, I did that this past April, and it was again this life-changing kind of event experience that I never thought I would be capable of doing. But if there's one thing that mountaineering, Manaslu, and Breathless has taught me, it's that I should never put any limits on what I think I'm capable of.
Amy, thank you for chatting to me today. It's been really good, and I wish you the best for the future.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's been great fun.
Speak to you later. Daddy, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Scots Care, supporting London Scots with financial grants, welfare advice, counselling, sheltered housing, jobs coaching and family support.